Welcome back. In our last session, we looked at the conclusion of Paul's visit to Philippi. In particular, we discussed his imprisonment, which led to an earthquake and the conversion of the jailer and his family. Then we saw Paul's defense, invoking his Roman citizenship, which led to Paul and Silas being released. From Philippi, Paul, Silas, and their company move west to Thessalonica, modern Thessaloniki, where he continues to preach the gospel, only to be hailed again before magistrates. But again he's released and continues west to Berea, where he meets less opposition, until people from Thessalonica arrive, stirring up ferment, forcing Paul to move south to Athens quickly. We ended our session with an account of Paul in Athens as he waited for the rest of his company. When all have arrived, Paul engages the philosophers of Athens and ultimately is brought to the Areopagus to discuss his novelties with the leading men of the town. In our current session, we'll follow Paul as he leaves Athens and travels westward along the Sea of Corinth, seeing his evangelization efforts in Corinth that will bring him before yet another magistrate, Gallio. Paul's initial visit to Corinth will end with his taking a vow at the port town of Cenchreae. From Corinth, his company crosses east to the great Asian city of Ephesus, from which he returns to Caesarea, thus ending his second missionary journey. Without much of a break, however, he and his company depart from Caesarea on a third missionary journey, traveling through Galatia and Phrygia to Ephesus, where he encounters the followers of one Apollo. So, before we pick up this second missionary journey, let's once again orient ourselves on the map. At the end of the last session, Paul was in Athens, from which he moved westward to Corinth, which is the furthest point of the second missionary journey, donated by the change of color in Corinth from red for the outbound journey to green, which traces his return. In the return, he crosses the Aegean to Ephesus, and after a stop, leaves directly by sea for Caesarea. We pick up the text of Acts at chapter 18, verse 1, where Luke tells us that after the events in Athens, Paul separates himself from the Athenians and travels to Corinth, seemingly alone, as the text notes. He went, it says. Upon his arrival in Corinth, he finds a gentleman by the name of Aquila, a Jew, a native of Pontus. He had arrived recently from Corinth with his wife Priscilla. They were expelled from Rome by an edict of Claudius, which spelled out that all Jews were to depart from the city of Rome. This edict, mentioned by the historian Suetonius, was seen as being given in AD 49, because many Jews were fighting among themselves over a certain Christus, which many see as a misspelling of Christos, or Christ. They were most likely believers in Jesus prior to their expulsion from Rome. Before going into more detail on Paul, Aquila, and Priscilla, let's take a moment to look at the city of Corinth, which was located on the Isthmus of Corinth, which connected the Peloponnesus, or the southern part of Greece, to Achaia, the northern part. This city was destroyed by the Romans in 145 BC, only to be restored by Julius Caesar as a Roman colony in AD 27. Eventually, it became the capital of the region of Achaia. Due to its strategic location, ships able to make their way across the isthmus could get from Ephesus to Rome without having to sail the whole distance around the Peloponnesus. Thus, it became a major port city with two ports, Cenchreae and Lycaon, and thus a bustling trade center which led to a very large population. In addition, the fact that people from many lands were passing through Corinth, it became a center for several religious cults for many parts of the Roman world, and it particularly gained a reputation for notorious sexual immorality from many ancient writers, among whom are Strabo, who told of a temple of Aphrodite which was there that was so rich that it owned more than 1,000 temple slaves, courtesans, etc., whom both men and women had dedicated, who were both men and women dedicated to the goddess. And therefore, it was on account of these women that the city was crowded and grew rich. For instance, ship captains freely squandered money, and hence the proverb, "Not for every man is the voyage to Corinth." In his article on Corinth in the Anchor Bible Dictionary, Father Jerome Murphy O'Connor has noted that this and other stories in the ancient world have been shown to be pure fabrication. In reality, Corinth was neither better nor worse than its contemporaries. And to complete our orientation to Corinth, we have a few pictures. First, we have a map of the city of Corinth as it was in Paul's day. Note toward the center is the Agora, or the marketplace. This, as in other cities of the day, was one of the key meeting places where much business was transacted. At the head of the Agora is the Bema, where Paul was hailed before the proconsul Gallio. This second picture shows the remains of the Agora and the Bema, as one will see them today in the ruins of ancient Corinth. Overlooking the lower city is the Accra Corinth, or the Corinthian Heights, which is a mountain fortress which was used to defend the lower city. Finally, a picture of the Corinth Canal, which was dug from 1881 to 1893, connecting the Gulf of Corinth to the Saronic Gulf. Due to many difficulties, this canal never became a major shipping canal. Today, it's used mainly for tourist traffic. Paul then connects with Priscilla and Aquila, having shared a trade with them. He stays in Corinth with them and found work for all three, as they were, as Luke puts it, tent makers. Now, since tents in those days were made of leather, the trade most likely included all sorts of leather working. The trade was to support himself while he did the more significant work of evangelizing. Thus, every Sabbath in the synagogue, Paul would engage in debate, persuading both Jews and Greeks. Note, in Corinth, Paul follows the same general pattern as he has everywhere before. As proof that there were synagogues in Corinth, during excavations in the archaeological site, the column pictured here was unearthed, showing menoroth, or 3 7-branched candlesticks, which are a very prominent sign in Judaism. The inscription on the top carries the remains of the phrase, Synagogue of the Hebrews. Finally, Silas and Timothy arrive from Macedonia, and they find Paul devoting himself to the word. The use of the Greek verb suneko seems to imply that Paul was now moving from splitting his time between plying his trade and preaching the word to a singular preaching of the word. That is, preaching and testifying to the Jews that the Christ that is, the anointed one, the Messiah, was Jesus. As has happened several times before, the Jews in Corinth oppose him and revile him. Luke notes that Paul's reaction is precisely what Jesus told the apostles in his instructions on sending them out for the first time. And so he shook out his garments. He shook the dust from his feet, saying, "Your blood be upon your heads. I am innocent of it." Note that Paul's move to the Gentiles is due to the Jewish rejection. It's not his choice, just as it has not been his choice before. They had their chance, and they have rejected the message and the messenger. Therefore, from now on, he will go to the Gentiles. Therefore, Paul enters the house of Titius Justus, a man who feared God. That is, if you will recall, a Gentile who followed Judaism but did not formally become a Jew. Some scholars have questioned whether this is actually Titus, who will eventually receive the letter from Paul and become the leader of the community in Crete. Conveniently, Titius's house was right next door to the synagogue. Hence, a new house church is in the process of formation. But Paul did not totally strike out with the Jews in the synagogue. The ruler of the synagogue, the archysynagogos, Crispus, became a believer, along with his entire household. This seems to be a theme. Notice how many households have converted to Christianity due to Paul's evangelizing efforts. In addition, many of the Corinthians who heard the message believed and were baptized. Note that the baptism of Crispus is mentioned by Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians, but there's no mention here of a Stephanus or a Stephen, whom Paul specifically recalls, who with his household were among his first converts in Achaia, 1 Corinthians 1:16. Paul is encouraged by the risen Lord in a vision one night, when he was told not to be afraid, but rather keep speaking and do not be silent. The reason for this assurance is that the Lord will be with Paul, and no one will attack him leading to harm, for many people are the Lord's in the city of Corinth. As a result, Paul remains in Corinth 1 year and 6 months, that is, 1.5 years, during which time he teaches the Word of God among the Corinthians. This is one of the longest periods that Paul stays in any one community. Now, despite the Lord's assurances that Paul would not see harm, he's not immune from being hailed before officials, as in other towns as we have seen. Paul's teaching has upset the Jewish population, who try to silence him by bringing him before local magistrates. In this case, the local magistrate of Corinth was one Lucius Junius Gallio. He's significant for several reasons. First, he held the position of proconsul of Achaia, and Corinth was the chief city of that province. From an inscription known as the Rescript of Claudius, written to the citizens of Delphi, it mentions the 26th acclamation of Claudius as emperor, which occurred during the first 7 months of AD 52, thus dates to May or June of AD 52. It implies that Gallio was no longer in office in Corinth. Thus, the events about to unfold had to take place prior to June of AD 52. And since Claudius routinely sent his proconsuls from Rome to their respective areas no later than mid-April, Gallio more than likely arrived in Corinth no later than May of AD 51. Thus, Gallio served as proconsul more than likely for a period of less than 1 year, from late AD 51 to June of AD 52. It's from this that most scholars will begin to construct the dates of events in Paul's life, knowing that he was in Corinth in AD 52. Finally, this Gallio was the son of Marcus Annius Seneca, the younger brother of Lucius Annius Seneca, the well-known Stoic philosopher of Rome, which would make Gallio Seneca's nephew. So Luke tells us, in the proconsulship of Gallio, Jews made a united attack upon Paul and brought him to the tribunal presided over by Gallio. The precise spot in Corinth of this hearing was known as the bema, or the rostrum, or the place of public announcement. The charge they gave, as contrary to the law, this one persuades or misleads the men to reverence God. Again, let's set the scene with some pictures. First, we have a picture of the bema as it exists today. It stands at the head of the marketplace, or the agora. The sign on the front of it says in Greek letters, bema, rostrum. This second picture is one of the grand entrances to the agora. Then, as we saw earlier, the remains of the agora. And finally, the remains of the Temple of Apollo, which dominates one end of the archaeological site in Corinth. Now, contra to Pontius Pilate, to whom Gallio is many times compared, Gallio responds, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, I should have reason to bear with you, O Jews." In other words, Gallio sees right through the ploy of the Jews. Continuing, he says, "But since it is a matter of questioning about words and names in your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things, of such things." Gallio stands up to the Jews of Corinth, not like Pilate in the hearing concerning Jesus, who eventually caved in to the Jews' commands in Jerusalem. For Gallio, that finished the matter. Now, there is a bit of debate on the force of the Greek word used in this next sentence, apelauno. It can mean to drive away or dismiss. In any case, the verb has the sense of causing one to move away by threat or force, thus drive off or expel. This reaction of Gallio did not please the Jewish accusers. In fact, they reacted by seizing their own leader, a gentleman by the name of Sosthenes, who was identified as the archysynagogos, or ruler of the synagogue, and beating him in full view of the bema. Even this does not move Gallio, who says their actions are of no concern to him. Now, the identity of this Sosthenes is curious also. Since he's identified as archysynagogos, did he succeed when Crispus was converted? Or was he possibly a co-leader with Crispus? Further, does he eventually come to profess belief in Jesus? As Paul, in his opening of the first letter to the Corinthians, identifies himself and one Sosthenes as co-authors of the letter. So, after considerable days, Paul bids farewell to the Corinthian brethren and sails for Syria along with his friends Priscilla and Aquila. Since they're sailing east, they will depart from Corinth's port of Cenchreae. So the center of action now shifts there. Paul, because of a vow that he had taken, cuts his hair at the port. The singular middle grammatical form of the verb implies that Paul himself cut the hair, and the vow was Paul's. This is what the port of Cenchreae looks like today. To see these pictures, one would never envision ships traveling the Mediterranean departing from there. It almost looks like a small beach. Now, given the fact that this vow involved the cutting of hair, the vow in question must have some relationship to the Old Testament Nazarite vow that's described in Numbers 6, 1-21, and was practiced by Samson. Johnson notes, a Jew could dedicate himself or herself to God in a special way by abstaining from strong drink, uncleanness, and the symbol of this was letting their hair grow during the period of the vow. The shaving of the head would come at the end of the vow rather than at the beginning. Now, the first major stop on the return journey was Ephesus. There, Paul left Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus. He, for his part, went to the synagogue and held discussions or debates with the Jews. Contrary to other locales, the Jews at Ephesus invite Paul to stay longer, but he declines. But he does tell them, if God is willing, I will return again. Thus, the door is left open in Ephesus. Paul then departs from Ephesus, as you can see from this point on the map. He makes no other stops until he arrives in Caesarea, where he greets the church at Caesarea. But he's not long at Caesarea when he heads back north to Antioch, thus ending his second missionary journey. There's no recollection of what transpired in Antioch when Paul arrived. Luke simply tells us that he remained in Antioch for some time, and then he left. This is the beginning of what's known as Paul's third missionary journey. Jensen notes that the end of Paul's second journey and the beginning of his third are so briefly and casually recorded by Luke that the reader in Acts is hardly aware that a new missionary crusade has begun. Now, as with the second journey, Paul departs Antioch, as we see in the red line here, and then travels overland, visiting the churches he found in the Galatian and Phrygian territories during the first journey. Tracing the red outward route, we see he visits his hometown of Tarsus. From there he moves to Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, Antioch and Pisidia, all on his way to Ephesus. One could say that these were pastoral visits to the communities he had founded earlier. These visits were meant to strengthen the disciples in those cities. Here we have a map that shows the city of Ephesus at the time of Paul. Ancient Ephesus is one of the most spectacular archaeological sites in the world. About 10 to 15% of what you see on the map has been excavated. The most striking feature of the site is the Library of Celsus, found in the lower middle of the walled city. Secondarily is the theater to the right of the Agora. It's here that the riot of the silversmiths is said to have taken place. In the site as you move through it, the actual streets have been unearthed, and it's possible to walk the streets where Paul more than likely walked. Now, as with other sites, we have a few pictures to give you an orientation to the city of Ephesus, as can be seen in the archaeological site. Our first picture is known as Curate Ii Street, which ends at the Library of Celsus, which can be seen in the distance, that tall building with the columns. As one goes down Curate Ii Street, you pass the remains of a building known as the Temple of Hadrian. And as you reach the end of Curate Ii Street, you stand in front of the library. Here is a picture of the remains of the library. And finally, connecting the library with the theater is Marble Street, pictured here. Luke then quickly switches his interest to Ephesus, and in particular to a certain Jew who recently arrived in Ephesus by the name of Apollos. Further, he's identified as a native of Alexandria and an eloquent speaker. Alexandria housed one of the most extensive libraries in the ancient world, and thus made it a natural center for learning and a center for Hellenistic literature. Being from there, one can presume that Apollos was quite well educated in both Greek literature as well as Jewish scriptures and literature. This same Apollos more than likely is the one mentioned in 1 Corinthians, whom some try to portray as in opposition to Paul in his company. Paul, however, sees him as a co-worker. Further, this Apollos has been instructed in the way of the Lord, and is described as speaking with an ardent spirit. The Greek gives the sense of the spirit bubbling up within him. The verb zeo literally means to boil. Thus, through this spirit, he's boiling over with the message of Jesus. But he knew only the baptism of John. So his knowledge of Jesus comes from John or one of John's followers, and thus is incomplete. Remember, the baptism of John the Baptist was only to prepare for Jesus. It was not the whole story. The Preacher's Outline and Sermon Bible gives us a good summary of where Apollos is coming from. It says, Apollos had learned the Old Testament scriptures by memory and spent hours meditating on them. He understood and believed them, grasping the promises of the Messiah. Therefore, when he saw and heard the proclamation of John the Baptist, he was ready to receive the promises of the Savior and to proclaim them. Apollos was speaking boldly. This verb, parareadzomai, consists of three basic parts. Para, the preposition meaning from beside, from or beside, the verb reo meaning to flow, and the ending adzomai having the sense of being made. Thus, his speech was made to flow out from beside him freely. He was not inhibited in preaching in the synagogue. It was there that Priscilla and Aquila heard him speak. Realizing that he did not have the whole story, they took him aside and they filled him in, and they filled in the blanks, explaining the way more accurately and completely. Recall that earlier in Acts we saw that the way was a euphemism for the Messianic or the Jesus movement. So, after some time in Ephesus, Apollos wanted to move on, crossing to Achaia. The brethren in Ephesus concurred wholeheartedly with Apollos' wishes, and wrote the brethren in Achaia that they should welcome this preacher. Kurtz notes that this practice of introducing a traveling Christian missioner, with a letter of recommendation was common in Paul's time. Apollos thus travels across the Aegean to Achaia, and was very helpful to those who had become members of the community through grace. That is, the hand of God, not the work of humans such as Paul. Further, if we read between the lines of 1 Corinthians 1, 1-4, it's clear that Apollos came to Corinth after Paul. Now, in Corinth, Apollos vigorously refuted the Jews in public, demonstrating through the Hebrew Scriptures that the expected Messiah was Jesus. This perhaps was an example of the watering of the seed that Paul planted, which he mentions in 1 Corinthians 3:6. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth, Paul says. We can safely say that Apollos, given the whole story, uses Scripture in much the same way as Paul has in his discourses with the Jews. Well, that's about all the time we have for this session. Next time, we'll continue Paul's ministry in Ephesus and look at the incident involving the 7 sons of Sceva, and finally the riot of the silversmiths, which ends with Paul returning to Macedonia. See you then.